Hi, good afternoon, everyone. You are welcome to the CSBS seminar series. This afternoon, we have with us Dr. Alice Wiemers from the University of North Carolina. She's a professor of history and Africana studies at the Davidson College. And today she will be presenting on local development in Northern Ghana. So she'll be going through this with us from a historical perspective. So Dr. Alice Wiemers is actually a professor of history and Africana studies, and her historical research focuses on how Ghanaians navigate economic and development policy through local, national, and global networks. The presentation today draws from her recent book, Village Work, Development and Rural Statecraft in the 20th Century, Ghana. She's currently beginning a new project in the intellectual and social history of Ghanaian policymaking at the intersection of Cold War transnationalism and the start of the neoliberal era. So Dr. Alice, we're happy to have you here, and you can kindly start your presentation.
Thank you so much. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I'm glad that the tech is working. This is an extremely fancy platform for me. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Dr. Jampong and Dr. Anyidoho for inviting me today and for organizing this event. I was telling both of them that I'm really grateful for the opportunity to bounce some of my historical work off of people who are really doing the intellectual and practical work of Ghanaian policy studies and policy formulation, often in the present. So this is an audience that I often wonder whether I can engage, and I'm excited to see what you make of it. So today I'll be discussing some of the research that was the basis for my recent book. So it's titled Village Work, Development and Rural Statecraft in 20th Century Ghana. And a note that I don't believe that the book is yet available at the Legon bookstore, but I am happy to send electronic copies of chapters or of the manuscript. And this is my email address. I'm also happy to chat with anyone more. Feel free to contact me. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about kind of where this project came from. I'm a historian, but the idea for this project came from a brief stint, about a 2-year stint of when I lived in New York and I worked for the United Nations Development Program as a pretty low-level policy analyst. And this was in the early to mid 2000s at the height of the turn to both the sort of good governance and related local development, a sort of obsession among international agencies. And I was struck at the time, even with just my sort of American undergraduate understanding of African history, about how much both the rhetoric and practice of these big international agencies echoed previous eras of development thinking dating back to the colonial era. And I was also struck, although this is probably not surprising to people who work in policy studies, how little discussions about history filtered into any of the day-to-day work of people's reflections on what they were doing. And I was struck by how much of this sort of ignorance of history had to do in part with a desire to simplify the work and a desire to depoliticize, particularly the field of sort of local development. So this is not a new thought. I mean, it wasn't new at the time either, but it's actually pretty rare for historians to do research about development over many decades rather than focusing on sort of particular projects or particular eras. So when I went to do my PhD, the formulation of this topic had to do just with the simple observation that development policy and practice change nearly every decade. But people who experience it sort of see developers come and go, right? That people live through many eras of development. So when I started working in Ghana, I was drawn to places where decades of public policy had been shaped around this idea of development. And I started work in what was then the northern region, what is now the northern and northeastern region, for a couple of reasons. So first, it is a region that has been historically, of course, underdeveloped. Some scholars have used the term non-development as well. And second, that it's a place that has been a perennial target of development practice. So if one of Walter Rodney's central insights about underdevelopment is that it is not the absence of development, but a deliberate process, I also want to point out that it's not the absence of something called the state or something like the developmentalist state, right? That the government is very present. So people from so-called underdeveloped areas actually have quite a bit of experience with development. So my work is an attempt to kind of think through the politics that emerge over time, both in the practice of governments and in how people navigate development. So the work that I'm going to draw on today was centered at the regional archives in Tamale and in oral interviews in the West Mamprusi district capital of Waliwali and in the town of Pasimpe, which is about 30 kilometers off of the main north-south highway. The archival and oral historical research took place mainly between 2008 and 2015, over about, I'd say, 18 months over that time period, and then with follow-up research trips to share my findings, to confirm contributions and quotations with folks who I had interviewed. And a lot of that work was centered on this town of Pasimpe, which is sort of down here. Some of you may know it. But it was very much, I want to make clear, not a kind of village study. So I was really interested in tracing regional, national, and international linkages that had brought particular projects to the town of Pasimpe, and the way that these same networks connected so-called local people to wider regional and national and international networks. I'm extremely grateful to the people in Pasimpe, in Waliwali, in Tamale, in Accra, who took the time to talk with me to share their insights and to allow me to use their insights in my work. I also want to point out that it's, and we can talk more about this, it's very clear that I was positioned very specifically in this research. So as someone who was sort of an outside expert, even in history, as a white American woman, who was then at a quite prominent university. I was a PhD student at Johns Hopkins University. My presence was in some ways an echo of what I was trying to historicize. And so, and I also want to note that my Mampruli was never such that I could understand the historical resonances of everything that folks were saying. So I often worked through an interpreter for people who didn't speak English. And so I think of my research as sort of being limited in really profound ways, and I'll talk about that, but also in kind of accessing and being shaped by how people have engaged with other outside experts over time. I was also interested in wider networks and long-term trends, which meant I spent the most time with people who were the most established in town and who were the most networked. So a big chunk of my research, which I'll talk a little bit about today, centered on the family of the late chief Wulugunaba Sebiam. If any of you know Wulugunaba Professor J.S. Nabila in the geography department here, that's his father and his family network. And I'm super grateful to him and to his family for allowing me to do this work. But this meant that there were a lot of politics that I simply wasn't going to hear about in town, right? And so I tried to shape my research around these connections and around embedding this sort of local place in the way in which it had been seen by eras of developers. So today I'm going to talk about my work in two ways. First, I want to talk about some of the broad and perhaps surprising continuities in how 20th century governments conceptualized and implemented small-scale rural works. And second, I want to talk about some of the more specific examples of strategies by which rural residents navigated development over the long term. In both cases, I'm just going to scratch the surface. I'm glad we have ample time for Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to what people in this audience particularly have to see in this work. I also want to note that the research, it's historical research, and my ending point was 1992. So I'm interested in the resonances, but also perhaps dissonances that people see between sort of what was going on in the 20th century and what people are seeing in the 21st. So this first section really looks at sort of how governments have seen and continue to rely on what I'm broadly calling village projects, so small-scale rural development projects that I'll characterize in a few ways. I argue through this period that wave after wave of development has reinforced a sort of simplified imaginary of rural areas as seas of undifferentiated rural villages, creating unevenly scattered village projects as a key strategy for rural service provision. I found myself asking why, if it is so immediately obvious to anyone basically that rural life is not bound in generic or identical villages, right? Everyone knows that. And yet so much of policy and development practice continued to behave as if it was. So I asked why that was happening. And in general, I picked up on sort of two broad reasons over this long time period. So one is that village projects emerged as a simple way of dealing with resource constraints. Funding was never such that northern rural areas were even close to a minimal threshold of schools or roads or water projects or healthcare facilities. And so the idea that there would be pilot villages or that projects would serve as an example remained a really common idea and fiction over the long term, over decades, and something that developers relied upon. The other insight is that choosing among villages was a way of suppressing or at least avoiding the details of local politics. So at a basic level, having development projects be interchangeable meant that the threat was always there that they could be taken away if local politics became too messy. And so, in other words, village projects have prized the performance of consensus and of competent local leadership, which I'll talk more about today. I also spent a lot of time in the work, and I'll spend a little bit of time today talking about unpaid labor, which was a real through line of the book, called communal labor, self-help, or more recently, often simply participation. The result of all of this these long-term trends has been an uneven landscape of rural areas in which some rural spaces and certain people are particularly tied to regional, national, and international networks, and a situation in which it is very difficult for rural residents to incorporate village projects into larger political or developmental demands, to leverage these sort of isolated projects into something, larger demands for development. So I'm going to briefly sketch 4 eras, starting in the colonial period and going through the neoliberal era. Again, this will be pretty quick. The first chunk of my research, I went through colonial officials' monthly records, as well as regional files for the 1910s, the 1920s, and into the 1930s. And here I draw on my own work as well as the work of others like Carola Lentz and Kwabena Akram Perry. So as you know, Northern Ghana was and remains an incredibly vibrant and complex political space, right, with a multitude of political structures that did not fit neatly into colonial ideas or colonial imaginaries. It's also important to note that there were very few colonial administrators in the North. It was considered a hinterland and a labor reserve. And so in a lot of areas, particularly with having eras having to do with land or chieftaincy, colonial administrators got drawn into complex politics that they desperately wanted to avoid. And I argue that it was through this experience of coming to understand the complexity of local politics that they fell back on a much more basic technology when it came time to extract labor. They turned to simple lists of villages that were in particular areas. And they relied on this list because they were willing to substitute one village for another. So in places where local leaders were able by coercion or cooperation to raise labor, became places where colonial officials spent quite a bit of time and focused, say, road labor efforts on. By the late 1930s and the 1940s, this idea of the village had sort of taken on a larger life, both in colonial policy and beginning in international policy with ideas about community development. And the village became a kind of primary unit of analysis for the first development projects in the northern region. This is largely school building and local roads, both as a way to allocate funds, very sparse funds, but also as a way to repackage colonial labor demands as something, and labor extraction as communal labor. So I trace a lot in the book the ways in which the coercion of forced labor and the supposed consensus of communal labor become inextricably tied in this period. And it's in this era that I argue that demands for unpaid local labor became entrenched as a strategy for governments to think about allocating development funds. It's also an era in which a model of so-called progressive chiefs or local leaders became very prominent. If local leaders were seen as progressive, largely because they were able to raise labor, those places became sites for schools and roads. So the next period I want to talk about is broadly the Nkrumah era. So I'm including the 1950s, when Nkrumah's influence on colonial policy was undeniable, as well as into the formal Nkrumah regime. So obviously, so much changed during this period about the politics of development, about the politics of nationalism, about the politics of citizenship. It's a period of obviously tremendous change. And in this research, I worked with regional government files, a database I started compiling of several hundred petitions that were sent to local and regional governments from 1957 until 1992, and oral historical research in Pasampe and in Wali Wali as well. So there were some big changes, obviously, in this era. Funding increased dramatically, bolstered by advocacy for regional development funds, as well as new international and national interests. Development, of course, became a rallying cry for all sorts of political projects. And at the same time, political networks through Nkrumah's CPP and through the Northern People's Party became much more important in how folks navigated the state. But there were also, I argue, really important continuities. The Nkrumah government's development plans were largely large-scale, industrial, and export-oriented, meaning that even though funding was increasing, it remained quite small in comparison to needs, and politics went very quickly into a kind of zero-sum game among different rural locations. The Nkrumah government's rhetorical emphasis on self-help in the northern regions was very clearly about saving money and about leveraging earlier patterns of labor extraction. Political connections were added to the mix, but didn't change some of the fundamental arguments around development. So while lots of politics shifted to lobbying for new districts or district capitals, I trace several examples of where these arguments were articulated in some of the same terms around ability to raise communal labor and places where local leaders were competent or development-minded. It may seem inevitable in some ways that there would be continuities, it's true, but there's obviously not the only possible politics, right? So I'm arguing that in this period, larger scale demands for restructuring national regional priorities and for restructuring international orders of development were largely out of reach for folks in the North. The third era I talk about is what recently folks have begun to think of as the long 1970s. So the period between the 1966 coup and Rawlings' ascension in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So it's a period that's often overlooked, at least in historical research, and in which scholars are beginning to think more about the range of political and social projects that Ghanaians engaged in the period. Here, I relied on oral interviews in Pasampe and with former government agents in Tamale and in Wali Wali, as well as the archival record, which is pretty thin for this era, but included quite a few petitions for development, and also on files that I could gather and get access to in individual ministries and districts. So I'll talk briefly just about two big insights from this period. One is that this was a period of tremendous local innovation around development, particularly in light of the dramatic switch in national development policy toward food production in the northern regions. So this is not my theme today, but I write a bit in the book and in other research about how people experienced large-scale agricultural programs in the 1970s, and I'm happy to talk more about that. The second insight is that these more diffuse agricultural inventions again put local works kind of on the back burner, right? So there was continued to be very little funding for health posts, schools, etc., meaning that again, competition over scarce resources among rural areas became an important way of thinking about politics. In the face of instability in national political networks that had sort of dominated during the Nkrumah years and then became very unstable, as well as these limited resources, rural residents and leaders again picked up strategies from earlier decades of engaging the government around ideas of self-help and demonstrations of competent or development-minded local leadership. The book ends in the 1980s with the beginning of the neoliberal era, and here I draw primarily on interviews in Pasenpe, and with folks who'd been involved in development planning and policy, as well as some sparse archival records and records that continue to exist in the registry offices of district assembly offices and that haven't been yet transferred to the archives. So the major trends I trace in this era are the dismantling of agricultural subsidies and the way that small-scale village projects became, again, much of what development meant in rural areas of the northern regions. I trace what has been called the NGOification, or I might also argue kind of the international development organizationification of small-scale development. So all of these international agencies, international NGOs, and local NGOs taking up the work of village projects as structural adjustment policies took over, and as the revolutionary organs of the Rawlings administration struggled with very low funding to implement development. So this is clearly a very well-studied era in policy studies, and it's here I think that my work as a historian, I hope, helps to engage some of that literature. So in some ways, I think of this as kind of the long-term payoff of looking at all of these decades before on the theme of what governments do, which is to reveal that much of what has been considered new about the neoliberal era, particularly in local development, so the reliance on these small-scale project-based schemes, and a turn to the rhetoric of participation or ownership, was profoundly not new at the time. It was not new to folks that projects could come and go, that sites were going to be considered interchangeable, and that local unpaid labor and demonstrations of consensus would be required. And so I focus on both how government officials and rural residents drew on their long-term accumulated experience in this era. Regional staff members, for example, of the national mobilization projects spent their time writing proposals to PAMSCAD and to development agencies and identifying particular villages where they knew that local labor would be easy to come by. And local residents, for their part, were acutely aware that projects could come and go and that labor and performances of consensus would be required. Here, I make the argument that funders were not so much extracting labor as they were looking for something that they could call success. For funders, small projects, regardless of how inadequate, became evidence that development was happening, became evidence that something more would happen, regardless of how inadequate the projects ended up being. So I know that's a long sweep of history in a short amount of time. I just want to sum up what I've hopefully just illustrated in this section, which is that over the course of the 20th century, despite very profound shifts in the way that governments thought about development and implemented development, small-scale rural projects have remained a key way that governments have interacted with rural Ghanaians. Viewing these projects as interchangeable has been a key way that governments handled resource constraints and either suppressed or avoided the messiness of rural politics. And furthermore, as part of these projects, unpaid labor endured as one of the key ways that rural residents and leaders interacted with government. So in this next section, I want to briefly touch on a few ways that my work tries to examine how this long-term history of development policy shaped strategies of people who were the so-called targets of development. So the first example is in local labor organization. Through the decades, I focused on how people in Pasenpe and in other towns organized so-called communal labor for development. And this shifted quite a bit over time from a set of practices that were very much focused on chieftaincy and on discourses borrowed from farm work toward a sort of more open source set of skills around raising communal labor and strategies that different sets of leaders took up over time, although I'll return to the question of who these local leaders were. Throughout, it was clear that the agents of development, the people coming in to do the projects, did not know how to organize local labor, right? This was never in their purview. And they did, in fact, very little to inquire about how labor was being organized. So there are, I want to be clear, many reasons why rural residents might come out to perform self-help labor and many reasons why they might refuse. And I'm happy to talk more about this. But I want to point out that it was nearly impossible for those particular or collective reasons to become legible for developers. So the reasons that people were producing labor, the reasons that people engaged in these development projects never became sort of part of what developers thought about their work. As long as there was someone organizing labor and enough laborers showed up, it was most often read as support for particular development projects or as evidence of the competency of local leaders. And one of the most potent illustrations I have of how this long-term experience shaped these dynamics was the reflections of a former pastor and longtime development activist in Pasampe, who argued that when projects came, particular people acted as their hosts or landlords. So in this figuration, it is not developers that spurred or even set the terms for local participation, but it was rather local organizers that used long-term strategies to deal with an ever-changing set of developers acting as their hosts. And of course, this language around hosts and landlords echoes ideas about and borrows from ideas about local hierarchies and the basis to claims over local power, particularly over land and belonging. It's an area that I would love to dig more into, the ways in which ideas about belonging and local power and control became bound up in these ideas. The second kind of long-term strategy that I spent a lot of time talking through and tracing has to do with this question of who local leaders became and what it means to be local in this context. So here I draw on my research on this one particular family network of the late Wulugunaba Sebiam, who was chief from 1942 to 1992. Family networks, I find, became one of the key ways in my work to talk about how a model of undifferentiated rural villages took hold even as increasing numbers of people who were from the rural northern regions took up positions of power, right? So that folks continued to participate in this village imaginary, even though they obviously knew that it was not true. And how, just as some particular places like Pasampe accumulated experience with development, education and familial connections could bring some rural northerners into the state development apparatus itself. So what I found in my research when I was I wasn't thinking about family networks at all when I began, but I found that great numbers of people who I had spoken to, who'd acted as representatives of NGOs, of politicians and civil service in this area had all come from the same or laid claim to the same family network. And there's obviously tons of excellent and amazing research in Ghana, dating back to Christine Opong's work in the 1970s about family networks and the state. And so these are some of the roles. I can talk more about this family network. The Wulugunaba Sebiam was chief for 50 years. He had over 60 children. They all went to school, and over half of them took up jobs in the civil service or in non-governmental organizations. And so this chart is an attempt to just sort of trace some of the roles, both locally and regionally, that members of this family network came to take up over time. So when discussing the longevity of this, of government work in this family network, people sort of described two dynamics that I want to highlight. One is the importance of personal connections and family connections in accessing education and training, in understanding the work of the civil service, and in fact, in sort of being networked into different kinds of agencies. But family members also emphasized the sort of obvious point that having received this training and education, they became qualified to do the kinds of development work that they ended up doing. So what I want to point out here is that at the same time that development projects kind of reinforced the idea that there is such a category as a local leader, they were actually relying on and furthering the connections that civil servants made and that non-governmental organization workers made between local, regional, and national connections. The last thing I want to talk about is something I didn't get to delve into as much in my work as I wanted to, but I think is an area for further research, which is the ways in which different sets of people across the northern regions have used small-scale development projects and unpaid labor as part of alternate long-term social and political projects, some of which might challenge existing political orders or make claims to different bases of local power, as well as regional and national change. So there's some great examples from secondary literature here, Benjamin Tulton's work and Joseph Kachim's work on Konkomba activism, particularly in the 1970s. And in my own research, these are just a couple of quotations from this database of petitions that I compiled. I was struck by the number of times that even in this very sort of formulaic encounter with the government, the writing of a petition, you could see glimmers of the ways that activism around small-scale development was bound up in larger political projects. So here at the top, you have arguments from folks who consider themselves the literates in town about claims to local power. And on the bottom here, you have people tying ideas about local contributions of labor to ideas about revolutionary ideology, whether or not how strongly felt that is sort of something for larger digging. I also found in my oral historical research that several groups in Pasampe had used communal labor for a variety of political and social projects. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, members of the Amasachana self-help organization, which was pretty widespread across the region, brought a number of women, particularly those who had been prominent farmers, into a greater local profile. Similarly, but for different reasons, members of the Assemblies of God Church saw evangelism and local development as intimately tied, and particularly used those ideas to think about their engagement with the state. So as I mentioned, I've done less research on this than I would have hoped, but I want to end here because I think it's a point that I think folks who work broadly in policy studies know well, which is that the politics of development are varied and deep. I wonder, however, if we always appreciate the historical depth, not only of the politics that development or policy encounters, right, that a policy encounters politics, but that people who encounter policy bring with it a depth of experience of working with different waves of policy makers, and bring their own kind of politics to engaging with the state. So I'm looking forward to the question and answer period. Clearly, a lot has changed, and maybe some things haven't changed since the 1990s. I know that there are some folks with historical, just looking at the list of attendees right now, some folks with historical interests as well, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alice Wiemers. It was a very interesting presentation for me to really understand this kind of historical trend and think about what I've been thinking about personally is the whole idea of communal labor and unpaid labor. And personally, I've been looking at it, I've been thinking about it analytically, whether they make any difference, you know, do they convey a different message? For example, if we're talking about unpaid labor and talking about communal labor. But yes, that is me using my role as a chair to ask my first question, but I'll open the floor now to the rest of us here on Teams now to ask any question. Kindly raise a hand or send in your messages in the chat if you have any questions. Are there any questions? Let me see. Please go ahead with your question. I'm trying to figure out. George, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And Alice, thank you very much for the presentation. I grew up at a very small village in the 1980s of about 1,500. And back at that village, almost everybody was a farmer. And so during once in a week, one day in every week, we had to embark upon what was known as communal labor. And the youth, I belonged to the youth at the time, or children group. The children were supposed to sweep the street. The adults were weeding around the village, cleaning the public, place of convenience and all the other things. And at that time, you dare not, refuse to join whatever that happens. It was compulsory. Nobody was supposed to go to farm during that day. I remember, I think it was Tuesday. So Tuesday, nobody was supposed to go to farm. And that was a day set aside for communal labor and all those things. Today, I go back to that village, somewhere in Ahafo region, and the dynamics have changed. Not everybody there is a farmer. And so you cannot enforce communal labor. Because, for example, if somebody is a banker, a teacher, how do you ask this person not to go to work? And so things have changed. In any case, when I went there, I saw that, in fact, this very weekend I was there, I have realized that there is no more communal labor. They don't go for communal labor. Instead, Zoom Lion is the one that is doing the sweeping and all those things that we used to do those days. I'm not too sure what is happening in the North. With your experience in the North, how has it changed? Do they still do communal labor? And who enforce, if they do, who has been enforcing communal labor? In the case where a teacher lives in the community and has to go to work to teach, what happens to this particular teacher? Or if somebody decides that I will not join communal labor, what happens to this very individual? I'm very much curious and I want to know about that. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Alice, I think you can go ahead and maybe respond to these two questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'll maybe start with the second one, and then Dr. Jampong, if you want to maybe the question about calling something communal labor versus these other sort of terms that get used was the question, or is it? I want to make sure I'm getting at the heart of that question.
Oh, okay. So I think I wanted to know, as a concept, does it convey a different message when you're talking about unpaid labor, when you're talking about communal labor? Because I think just like George was talking about,
right.
In as much as communal labor has been used to help implement projects, in many of these rural areas, they were also used to for sanitation purposes, for other, community services that may not even be linked to a particular project. So and then comparing that to the kind of debate around unpaid labor, it's almost always about women's role, the kind of inequalities and hierarchical. So I just want to know if it makes any conceptual
Yes. That makes a ton of sense. So I should be clear that the term I'm using for unpaid labor is really because the terminology over this 70-year time period, it was quite varied, right? So what in the 1960s or the 1970s would be called by the government self-help, right, would often be called locally communal labor to tie it to some of these other ways in which people thought about labor. George, to answer to attempt to address your question. So what I was very interested in is, of course, there are just like so many ways in which labor sharing and not only for sort of, town development or town beautification, town cleanup, but also for farming, right? Thinking about ways in which labor sharing for farming becomes really entrenched over this. I mean, it's like a common thing people do. Plastering, all sorts of different ways in which labor sharing has pervaded rural life. What I think I was most interested in is the ways in which different kinds of government projects, and I think this is particularly true in some of the northern regions, although there's other places in Ghana, I believe, where this is particularly true, where governments perceived that that the way to kind of tie development to some sort of local politics or local buy-in, but also honestly to save money, that they could kind of capitalize on traditions of communal labor, that they could capitalize on this idea in order to require, and this is just really pervasive, right? So a well project, it was required that people, in order to have the well be built, come out and mold blocks, carry water to build the well, right? In order for there to be school building projects, right? School building projects relied on labor that was envisioned as communal or self-help, but that also was a requirement of that development project. And so I think to answer the question about the long term, I think one of the ways, at least in the areas that I did research, that people dealt with the fact that a sort of across the board compulsory communal labor is no longer possible, and no longer feasible, and no longer would people be willing or even feel compelled to do that. So for teachers as a great example, that instead these projects were actually very limited in whether or not they cared whether everyone came out or just 50 people came out to do some to do some labor, to mold the blocks for the well, etc. And so I find that there's quite a bit of flexibility in this system, and that I think people appreciate that flexibility, but also it means that if you're refusing to do labor for some reason that is actually quite political, it's never going to show up in terms of how developers or governments think about local consent, right, or local buy-in for these sorts of projects. Adjoa, I hope that sort of addresses your question as well, about thinking about the often profound distance between the way that people thought about what they were doing with their own labor and why, and how governments sort of classified and required this kind of labor. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very good one. We also have a question from the chat. Sadat, would you like to ask the question, or you would like me to read it out? Okay. So in the chat, he says that thank you, Prof, for your great presentation. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of History looking at similar work on oil development. So your work connects so well. My question is, why did you choose Tamale, Wale, and Pasenpe instead of, and there is similar connections, of with regards to Southern Ghana and development in general. So I think she's asking why you chose these areas and if there are any connections to other parts of the country. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to see you, Sadat. I remember meeting you in Tamale this summer, and hearing your presentation at the Ghana Studies conference. So I appreciate the question. So I started working in the northern regions really because it in the sort of early, like 2008 when I started my research. I mean, it was a place where it was very palpable that all sorts of development agencies were having work done, right? So I have a picture of a signboard, a sort of street corner in Tamale in 2008, in which all of the signboards were for different international agencies like SIDA and then World Vision, and then there were a bunch of local NGOs. I mean, it was that was really dominant. I am sort of delighted when I returned to Tamale that has become less dominant in the landscape of Tamale over the last 15, 20 years. The way I started working in Wale and in Pasenpe was really through this kind of inductive process from the archives of thinking about places that kept showing up, places in which, this became a good area for development over time. And then also because I started being interested in and connected to the family network of the chief of Pasenpe and thinking about family networks that way. I do, this is not my area of research, but from reading, Dr. Anya Doho has some older work about work in the Afram Plains. I think in a lot of what I do is very, or a lot of what this book is about places in which resource constraint, governments not wanting to invest money is like very, very prominent in the way in which politics play out, which is obviously very different than your work, right, in oil developments. But I wonder, I'd love to have a conversation about how some of the same dynamics play out, even though there are very different underlying sort of political economy there.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm in a bus transiting, so I can't speak much. I really wanted to hear you, and congratulations, and I'll send you an email to get some chapters to read for myself and add to my work. Ajua, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sadat. Sylvia, you can please go ahead with your question.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this presentation, Alice, and thank you, Abna, for allowing me. So I am a researcher myself, but then I'm interested in this topic. That's why I joined. So I wanted to know, over the period for which Alice conducted your research, do you think that there has been so much changes when it comes to using community labor or communal labor as an approach towards development or getting people to help, given that resources are constrained? Because as I'm concerned, resources being constrained is going to be a problem till the kingdom come. So what are the new changes, if there is, that has happened over the period that you studied? And also looking at what is the future of using this approach as a way of mobilizing human resources to help in communal development? I'm more concerned about how sustainable it is, given the fact that there has been this societal changes and dynamics, and people are getting into other jobs and probably will not be available. And the last one is, what can be done to make sure that, if there's anything that we can make sure that this approach to development can be sustainable? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, there's a couple of ways I can answer. So one, I think at least over the long term, the issue that I see with the strategy of using sort of communal or self-help labor as a key element of development is not really the problem with the labor itself. So most folks, at least for eras past like the early 1950s, don't talk about this as being like a problem, right? It's not a problem to do, like it's for most people, right? And especially if there's individual flexibility, right? Like folks who can't come aren't required to come. So, or, in a lot of these projects. But what really concerns me is the way in which people who implement projects rely on this, as you said, as a sort of human resources angle, or think about it as kind of a way to get local buy-in or participation, which I think also makes a lot of sense. But rarely is that paired with actually listening to people about why they are doing that labor or why they might not be doing that labor, right? And so thinking about it as compulsory, not because everyone is required to do it, but compulsory because if there's a place where the politics are such that labor is hard to raise, developers tend to just not go to those places, right? And so, I mean, I'm talking to people, at least in the period I was studying, so talking to people who'd worked for World Vision in the 1980s and the 1990s that would say things like, if the community was not united, we would not build a school there, right? If the community was not united, we would not, et cetera. And when you really dig on what people mean by united, they mean can people show up and do labor, right? Is that the image that people have, or the sort of the participation, the demonstration of consensus that people are able to give? And that concerns me as a form of politics, because people's individual stories often reveal a much more complex local landscape in which the appearance of consensus feels to be a performance that people have a lot of experience with, rather than something that they get to kind of shape to every individual project. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very
Professor
much.
Professor Nikia, I saw your hand up. Please, you can come with your question. Hi, Prof. Are you there?
I'm here. Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, I was talking and apparently I was muted. Forgive me. Thank you for that really interesting work. You know, I think your work is fascinating. But I just wanted to comment briefly on the last thing you said, because it so resonates with the work I do and how I try to teach social development. The misuses and abuses of terms like community and participation, right? And all the, just sticking with community, all the positive associations that are made in regards to the term community, and all the assumptions, you know, about unity, about a lack of politics, about maybe a lack of inequality, you know, just the way that that term is used to paper over important differences in interest and opinions and power. And of course, it's similar to the way that participation is used, which can mean anything from merely informing to people to consulting them, and very rarely to do with actual partnership and decision making. And I think that that's something that makes sense to people in other disciplines also. What you're saying from, you know, the perspective of a historian looking at this concept of village development is something that is echoed in other literature. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I mean, that means so much to me. I have long admired your work, and I also I feel weird ending this thing in 1992, because I know this is, you know, it's I don't want to make a kind of end of history argument, but I do think there's ways in which the last 30 years of politics around small scale development have very much calcified on some of these practices in ways that they become, I mean, to get to the last question, they become unsustainable, but they don't become unsustainable because they won't allow for small scale development. They become unsustainable because they're an unsustainable politics, right? They're an unsustainable way of thinking about why people engage with the state, and they give very little room for people to exercise their political voice. So I'm hopeful that all the work that folks who are working in this area do right now is ready to change some of that.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to read, there's a question in the chat, and then I'll allow Robert to ask the last question, and then you can answer them together. So there's a question from Emmanuel, who says, communal labor is a pro-social behavior from a volunteerism perspective. So does politics influence pro-social behaviors, or community members engage in communal labor? Robert, please, you can follow up with your question, and then she can respond to both of them. Hi, Robert, we can't hear you. Okay, I don't know what's happening. It's difficult to hear him. So maybe you can answer, you can respond to Emmanuel's question about pro-social behavior. Yeah.
And I want to pick up on something that Dr. Anidoho just pointed out, which is about local differentiation, power inequalities, as well as the way in which those so-called sort of local inequalities are tied to regional and national sort of structures of inequality. And so, yeah, I believe it. I mean, it is a pro-social behavior. And yet when I say politics, I mean, there's party politics, but there's also the way in which kind of questions about how people meaningfully influence the governance of their town, how people meaningfully influence the governance of regional, national, and perhaps international orders, in which simply reading labor as always a pro-social behavior and refusal of labor as an anti-social behavior disallows people from using their labor to protest, right? It allows it only reads that as antisocial. And I think there are examples. I mean, I think the example from the 1980s of sort of weekly town cleanup, right? You can see how that is both a sort of pro-social activity, but it's also enforced by all sorts of social norms, and it's enforced by all sorts of local power relationships. And I think it becomes even more complicated when agencies who really do have the power to refuse local services, right? To stop there being water projects, to stop funding school building, start trying to enforce those mechanisms of sociability without recognizing the underlying sort of political dimension of that work.
All right. Thank you very much, Doc. This has been a very interesting discussion. Personally, myself, I think I've really learned a lot, following through the history, and I'm hoping that many of us here can engage with your work. And when your book is also out, they can have access to it in one way or the other. So
yeah, I'll put my email up here again, and feel free to send that to anyone who'd like to contact me.
Great, I will do that. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you in our next bi-weekly seminar. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks and bye.